one of the reasons why I picked this project in particular is that I am not asking Calvinists who are the perpetrators, perpetuators. They are the ones continuing this straw man.
Right.
I'm not asking them to change their views
Right.
on election or total depravity or how they interpret Paul. I'm not asking, and those people hold near and dear to their hearts, right? I'm asking them to revise their history books.
Right.
I'm asking them to reconsider the Gallic monks as Semi-Pelagians, and that the conclusion should be they were not Semi-Pelagian.
Okay, everyone. Welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. My name is Anthony Costello, and today I am joined by my good friend and colleague, Jim Johansson, and also a good friend, not quite a colleague, but a good friend, Kurt Jaros. Don't let the spelling fool you, folks. It's Jaer-is, not Jaros or Jaros. All right, Kurt, I got that finally after all these years.
Thanks.
You reminded me that, I've been pronouncing it wrong this whole time. Okay, so today on the podcast, it's definitely a theological issue, although maybe there's some ethical implications for the reformers, or some of the reformers at least. But this is sort of our geeking out on theology episode. We're going to do a pretty deep dive into Kurt's dissertation, what he wrote for his dissertation, which was on Kurt, I don't know, maybe I will say you can correct this later, but the invention of the term and maybe even the idea of Semi-Pelagianism, right? Which is a term that pops up throughout later Reformation theology. And you have done a work on this, the term, the idea, and who some of the reformers attributed Semi-Pelagianism to historically. And you sort of are trying to right a few historical and theological wrongs on this issue. So that's the topic for today. I'll let you introduce yourself first, and then we'll go into the topic of our conversation.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Kurt Jaros, and I have a ministry called Veracity Hill Speaking Teaching Ministry. We make videos on, we've got a YouTube channel and are making videos and do public speaking and teaching. We put on conferences, and we've got other fun things we do, like on social media. We share Theologian of the Week. And so we pick a theologian and share about, a work or two of theirs and share a quote from them. So that's a fun little way of just keeping people from Christian history, sharing about them and having Christians alive today learn a little bit more about them. So we do fun things like that as well. I also run a nonprofit organization called Defenders Media, and we have clients that we create podcasts for and other ministries that we are developing. But my passion that I spent so many years writing on was on the so-called Semi-Pelagians. And I call them the Gallic Monks. They're from Roman Gaul. And I studied in particular their doctrine of original sin. And as I was studying their view of original sin, I came across what many people attributed to them and saw that this label really is the label of Semi-Pelagian is really a terrible label. And it's a misnomer, it's anachronistic, and there are others who have done an even deeper dive on the term itself. There's a great journal article out there on that. And so my dissertation in particular looked at their view of original sin. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify there, but I'm happy to talk more about even the history of the term. It's a Reformation era term that occurs 1,000 years after these guys existed. So I'm sure we'll get into that, and we'll define terms and talk about why it's a misnomer. But yeah, that's sort of just a brief introduction about myself.
Okay, that's good. So let's do this. before I read a quote from a 19th century Reformed theologian that uses this term, maybe we can back up to Pelagius himself, which will give us the context for this, what happens later in at least European Christian or Western Christian tradition with the Gallic monks and then the 16th century reformers. So can you give us just a basic rundown on who Pelagius was, what he taught, and maybe a little bit of Augustine's, what Augustine countered him with?
Yeah. So this is sort of the classic free will versus divine grace debate in the Christian tradition. And Pelagius was a part of the Christian church, and he was really deemed a holy man. He was really devout in his faith, and he ended up taking a trip to Rome and saw basically how corrupt it was, and he just could not believe in a sense, the aristocracy that existed in the Christian church. And so he was of the position that humans could take a robust approach to their faith. So much so that this led to issues over what he believed. And now there is some debate as to whether what he's accused of believing he actually believed. Now, we do know from the Council of Carthage that he in fact recants from those accusations. So he says, no, I don't believe those things. So that's a matter of historical record. You can view that in Augustine's own writings. Nevertheless, the heresy of Pelagianism, the idea that, there's a number of issues, but here are some of the key ones. One key aspect is that the fall affected only Adam, that every human that is born is created just like Adam. Okay, that's a critical feature to classical Pelagianism. Another belief is that you can earn your salvation. So this pertains to the necessity of the atonement, right? So if you're born just like Adam, well, what if you don't sin? If you don't sin your whole life, well, you don't need the atonement, right? So you see how these are kind of related. Whereas if you have a corrupted human nature, you're going to sin, and you require divine grace. You require the atoning work of Christ to atone for your sins. So you see how they're related. There were other issues as well pertaining to, for example, whether Adam was created mortal or immortal. There's a debate there. That's an interesting debate as well, because there are some scholars today that would actually say, certain conservative evangelical scholars that would say, actually, Adam was created mortal. That's why he needed to eat the fruit from the tree of life. But that's a classically Pelagian position. So another distinctive feature of Pelagianism is infant. Let's see here if I'm remembering. Adult baptism. So he rejected infant baptism. Okay, so this is interesting, because if you're, say, a Reformed Baptist, then you affirm believer's baptism or credo baptism. That was what Pelagius also believed. And that one, I don't know if he recants from that one in particular. I'd have to refresh myself. But so this is sort of this classic debate. Now, Augustine comes along and gives this robust sense of divine grace. This is the later Augustine. There's a shift in Augustine's thinking. It's called, you could do a Google search on the Augustinian shift. Augustine admits in multiple works that he changed his mind on the relationship between human free will and divine grace. So I have no problem identifying as an earlier Augustine myself. Of course, that's just my personal beliefs. I disagree with the later Augustine, but my historical research is sort of, on its own grounds, regardless of my personal beliefs. So you do have the later Augustine giving these arguments against Pelagianism, and Augustinianism wins the day. But there remains this question in that time, in the 5th century. There remains this question, are there still Pelagians in our midst? Does the remnants of Pelagianism continue to pervade in the Christian church? And this was a concern by a fellow named Prosper of Aquitaine. And Prosper was an opponent of a monk named John Cassian. So John Cassian was one of the monks that I studied. He's originally from the East, and he travels over to the West, to Roman Gaul, where he establishes two monasteries, one for women and one for men, in southern Gaul, in the modern day city of Marseille. John Cassian, he does this work. There's also another monastery on an island, and one of the fellows who would come to oversee that monastery, his name was Vincent of Lorentz. He was another monk I studied. And then finally, Faustus of Ries. He was a bishop. Not Faustus the Manichaean that Augustine writes against, but a different Faustus later, second half of the 5th century. So those are three Gallic monks whom I studied. Faustus's works have not been translated into English. So that was original work in the Latin that I was doing. Some Roman Catholics have written on Vincent because of his work called the Commonitorium. Protestants haven't really heard of him. And then John Cassian has sort of the most that's been written about him. Even some Protestants have written some books by him. So Chadwick, for example, did a biography. One of the first biographies of Cassian was by Chadwick. So that's sort of just a general approach and sort of setting up the stage for quote-unquote semi-Pelagianism.
Okay, good. So we have Pelagius, the devout priest monk, who has a couple signature teachings after his visit to Rome, where he sees the corruption and everything. The main one being, what is the role of, well, maybe not the main one, but what we're going to focus in on, the role of grace versus man's own capacity to refrain from sinning, right? And that's where, and did you say that in earlier Augustine, that Augustine is more open to that, but in later works, Augustine is emphasizing far more solely the work of God's grace, and sort of
It's
not
sort of this,
but downgrading the capacity of man.
Yeah, it's sort of this contemporary classic debate that many of us have on Calvinism versus Arminianism. Okay,
Right.
So
yeah,
so the earlier Augustine, he wrote this work called On the Free Will of Man. Okay, and it's a defense of free will, but it's not really the Calvinist view of free will. It certainly is not. If you were to read it, it's something different. And as time goes on, he talks about how he wrestled with the relationship between free will and divine grace, and in the end, the grace of God won out. Right? So it's kind of like we're trying to solve this problem about the chronological priority. Well, what comes first? Does man accept the gospel of his own free will, or does divine grace enable him to accept the gospel? So what comes first? Well, so for these Gallic monks, they were of Eastern thinking. And so they didn't play this ball game on nature versus grace, because it was not to them an either or. Rather, it was a both and. It's both the grace of God and the free will of man working together. And this is why the contemporary definitions of semi-Pelagianism are flawed, because the contemporary definitions will describe semi-Pelagianism as the idea that man can take the first steps in salvation and grace comes later. Grace comes later. That's a very common way. That's the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology. That might be the way that Shedd defines it. We'll see. Wayne Grudem defines it that way. So you'll see this idea of man takes the first steps, then grace comes later. But when you read John Cassian, and you read Vincent, and you read Faustus, that they would have rejected that definition right away, because to them, the grace of God is everywhere in every good thing.
Let me do this. Let me read a quote, okay, from a systematic theology textbook that I used in seminary, and maybe you did too, because we were both at Talbot, although I don't know that we did the same degrees at Talbot.
Yeah.
But this was, and it was I enjoyed this dogmatic theology by, this is Shed, okay?
Okay.
Dogmatic
And he's going to
theology,
tell
and
us
Shed
what
would,
semi-Pelagianism is.
well, he doesn't give it that, but I looked it up right before we got on, and there's about 10 entries under Semi-Pelagianism, maybe 10 or 12. And I wanted to, just give an example, because now Shed is late 19th century, second half of the 19th century. So I can't remember exactly. He's writing maybe in the 1870s. Okay, so 350 years roughly after the Reformation. And I think we can see here the term is already just cooked into the Reformed tradition now at this point. And this is what Shed says, writing again in or around, and this is under Man's Primitive State. This is Alan Gomes's edited volume, which is actually a very nicely edited volume. Got to say that because Alan was my former professor, but it is. It really is a nicely edited volume, and he did a lot of really good work and a lot of great notes and everything. But he says, and I quote, "Concreated holiness is one of the distinguishing tenets of Augustinianism. Pelagianism denies that holiness is concreated. It asserts that the will of man by creation and in its first condition is characterless. Its first act is to originate either holiness or sin. Non pleni nascimer. We are not born full of character. Adam's posterity are born as he was created, without holiness and without sin." And that's kind of what you mentioned earlier. Now he says, Semi-Pelagianism holds the same opinion, accepting that it concedes a transmission of a vitiated physical nature, which Pelagianism denies. So far as the rational and voluntary nature of man is concerned, the Semi-Pelagian asserts that holiness, like sin, must be self-originated by each individual. Tridentine anthropology is a mixture of Pelagianism and Augustinianism, end quote. Okay, so I think the key components there is what he's saying is Semi-Pelagianism, which again is already sort of embedded in the Reformed tradition here now. He doesn't say who, and he doesn't say where it arose.
Yeah, he speaks generically of the semi-Pelagian.
There's a Semi-Pelagianism, and this is what they hold. The Semi-Pelagian view asserts,
whoever they are.
Well, he's using it in the impersonal, right? Semi-Pelagianism asserts. Yeah. So this abstract view asserts that holiness, like sin, must be self-originated by the individual. And then he mentions Tridentine anthropology, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Kurt, but that's a reference to Trent, correct?
I think that's right. But so the whole point here, though, is that even what you described there, this idea that it's on man to work up to holiness without divine, right? The implication is without divine grace, right? That it's the job of man.
Yeah, self-originating.
Self-originating. Yeah. They would have absolutely rejected this definition. Absolutely would have rejected it. I mean, all you have to do is I could pull out from my right from my desk here sections of John Cassian's conference. In particular, we'll take number 13, and he talks about the providence of God and how grace is in everything. If you'd like, I'll in fact do that here.
Well, before we do that, let's do this. Before we do that, because I read this 1870s Reformed theologian who, again, he doesn't say anything about the Gallic monks. He doesn't even say who Semi-Pelagians are. And I don't think he does in the rest anywhere else in the dogmatic, in this systematic theology. I think he just uses it in the abstract. Semi-Pelagianism asserts, or Semi-Pelagians say. right? Maybe
Yeah.
he'll say something like that. Let's do this before we get to the monks themselves. Where
Okay.
does Shedd, writing in the 19th century, get this idea of semi-Pelagianism to begin with then?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you look at the term itself first appears in the writings of Theodor Beza, who was, the Calvin's disciple. That's the first time the term semi-Pelagian appears. And he uses it to refer to Roman Catholic intra-debates, the Molina Jesuit debates. Okay, so they're the semi-Pelagians. All right. And then eventually, sometime later, the term then becomes attached to these monks that lived shortly after Pelagius in Roman Gaul. So eventually there's this connection historically. But to your question, the term itself develops and evolves, where semi-Pelagianism is sort of this boogeyman term. It's the opponent. It's the other side. And so it takes on a life of its own. And it's not Augustinian, and it's not full-on Pelagianism. It's something in between. It's something, well, what is that something in between? So as we see here, we've seen Shedd give Augustinianism. We've seen him give Pelagianism. Now he creates this in between. Now, whether he creates it or relays it, it's this in between. It's this bridge between the two. And so it just takes on this life of its own, even though it has no historical grounding. I'm waiting for someone to show me a written author who has defended semi-Pelagianism.
Okay, so, but you're saying then that as far as all your research has shown, the term itself, and that would just be semi-Pelagianism in Latin, right? It wouldn't be much different, right? Maybe there's a slight variation in that, but that originates with Beza?
Beza, correct. Yeah,
Okay.
1,000 years after the Gallic monks lived. They lived closer to the time of Christ.
Now, does Beza also attribute that view to them? Is he the one who says,
No,
there were these men? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, he attributes it to, he accuses it as an insult. It's used as an insult for the first decades of its existence. It refers, he's using it to refer to the Jesuit Molina debates in Roman Catholicism.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
and he's using it. And obviously, go ahead, Jim. Yeah.
I was just thinking. I thought it's interesting because as you know, like the distinct differences between the Eastern and the Western in the development of Christianity and theological perspectives and focus. And so, first of all, you have these three monks that go to Gaul from the Eastern side. I was curious if you actually found some type of development, some theological development as a result of that shift. Did you have like a historical that you could see their early writings and their later writings? Did you see sort of a trend that started to come out that way?
Well, so yeah, it's the three of them don't come from the East. Cassian comes from the East, and so he spent time with the Egyptian monastic desert fathers, and Cassian was eventually ordained into the diaconate by John Chrysostom. So he spent time with Chrysostom, and then he heads west, and basically he's asked to go help support a failing monastic movement in the West, where everybody sort of did what they thought was right with regard to monasticism. It was sort of an every man for himself thing. And what Cassian does is he institutes order. So his first work was called The Institutes, on the institution of the monastic order. And some of the chapters in the Institutes are basic, like what does a monk wear? When does he eat? When does he go to prayer? What are the things he does? How does a monk deal with the 7 deadly sins?
This is before Benedict, right? Is this before Benedict?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
And so his other work, Conference, he's got 3, but his other monastic work is called Conferences, and it's a relay, a conveying of the teachings of the Desert Fathers. It's sort of placed in conversational tone format, So John and his friend Germanus go and are taught. They learn under the Egyptian desert fathers, and so they ask questions, and the desert fathers answer. And so that's how the conferences is structured, about a lot of monastic issues, but other theological issues as well. The final work he writes is actually the only Western theological treatise against Nestorianism, and he was asked by the Pope to write that. So, which is really a cool thing, because Cassian critiques Pelagianism there. So you can see what he thinks of Pelagianism. So, when you read the primary sources, you really kind of come away thinking, what's going on here?
So I want to fill this out, because I already know what your main desire is, and was and still is, in having written this dissertation. You want to sort of see the attribution of this kind of straw man, right? This is sort of a historical straw man, but it did get attributed to three real people, three individual Christian theologians.
Well, and so there's reason for that.
See their sort of reputation cleansed from this attribution, I think, right?
Yeah. Now, one of the historical, there's a historical connection. So you might say, well, how does it develop over time to where people associate the term Semi-Pelagianism with this 5th century? Well, there was a council called the Second Council of Orange in the early 6th century, right? So 529. And when you read these canons, they almost read as if they're critiquing a sort of semi-Pelagian position. But a careful analysis, I argue, is that it's simply a re-condemnation of full-on Pelagianism. So, as you may know, when you have these church councils, they name the accused, and they describe what the accused believed. That doesn't happen in this regional council. There's nobody listed by name, and it's simply sort of this doctrinal, it's impersonal. If anybody says this, well, then let him be an anathema. If anybody says this, let him be an anathema. And you read those anathemas, you read those descriptions, and none of those descriptions fit Cassian, Vincent, or Faustus.
Mm-hmm.
None of them. And so you're like, well, wait a second. Who is this council critiquing then? It's not those guys. It must have been someone else. So maybe there was someone who's unnamed that it's addressing, or maybe it's simply a re-condemnation.
Trying to re-present Pelagius all over again. But if there is somebody like that, okay, so I'm sorry. For the sake of the audience, let's put some dates, some dates on these things, because we're nerding out here. But so Pelagius is he contemporary with Augustine or right before?
Contemporary. So think of 4 teens. The 4 teens. 400 teens decade.
400 teens. Yeah, early. So first half 5th century. Okay, 400, early 400s.
Yes, but you got to get more specific than that, because Augustine dies in 430 AD, and so he actually wrote about the Gallic monks and calls them brothers, because Prosper of Aquitaine wrote a letter in the 420s to Augustine.
Okay, so they're contemporary as well. I was thinking they were later in the 5th and early 6th. Okay.
So Faustus is a little late. Faustus is second half, but Cassian and Vincent are first half of the 5th century.
So all around the same time, first half of the 5th century, 400 to 450s. All right, is when we get the whole from Pelagius to the Gallic monks with Augustine in there. Okay, so it's not because I thought they were later. Okay, so but in the Council of Orange, right? Council of Orange.
Yep.
There's anathemas, but they're not anathemas and nobody's named in the anathemas.
Correct.
Right? And we would expect,
unlike the Council of Carthage, for example.
Okay, so where Pelagius was named.
Yep.
Is that right?
And his disciple Celestius. Yeah, so Pelagius and Celestius were named at the Council of Carthage. And of course, you can look at other church councils.
And you have an account of him recanting as well. Is that right?
Yeah.
You said earlier. Okay, but at Orange, you don't have anybody specifically named. So it's probably just relates back to Pelagius and his ideas, to Pelagius himself and his ideas as he
So
probably before
yeah,
his
that
recantation.
that's what I argue in my dissertation. Now there are
Okay.
some historical theologians who hold to a more traditional Protestant take that the Second Council of Orange rejected semi-Pelagianism, but I would even question their conclusions and say, well, who are these semi-Pelagians? Where are they? What are their writings? There's no evidence that there's any semi-Pelagian that
It's
exists.
kind of just lost to us then. It was lost in history.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, okay, that's the time period of Pelagian, Augustine, and the Gallic monks themselves. We're still gonna get into what the three monks themselves write. But my question is still then, okay, Beza is obviously okay, so he's using this as sort of a slur
Definitely.
against the Molinists or these inner Jesuit debates of the 16th. When is
16th
Beza?
century.
16th
Yeah, late
century.
16th century.
Late 16th, right? So it's kind of like second wave sort of the Reformation.
Yeah.
So, but then when does somebody come along and say and connect semi-Pelagian? When in the Reformation era does someone come along and connect the so-called idea of semi-Pelagianism to those three 5th century Gaelic monks? Is that
Yeah,
Calvin?
I'd have
Is
to.
that Beza? Who is that?
So it's after Beza. I'd have to refresh
Okay.
precisely when that point happens. There's a great journal article by, if you look up Bacchus and Grudrian and type the word semi-Pelagian, if you were to Google that, you'd find their PDF article on.
I want everybody to go look up that article immediately.
academia.edu.
Yeah.
It's like a 20-page article where they trace the history of the term. And so there is I'd have to refresh myself on the article, but they are able to find when someone for the first time says it was about those monks in the 5th century.
Okay, because that's kind of where it's like there's something maybe unjust going on there, right?
Yes, there is.
I mean,
yes.
If and maybe it'd be harder, if impossible to determine what the intentions of whoever did that was, or whoever the first theologian was to say, hey, there's this Pelagian view, something like what Shedd says here in the 19th century, that asserts holiness like sin must be self-originating. And by the way, there were a couple guys in the 5th century in Gaul who held this. Like maybe you wouldn't know exactly, because what I'm wondering is, because I thought we talked about this before, is this in some way a polemic against Rome, against the Roman Catholic Church of the 16th century, right? Is there a
that's the way Beza uses it.
Okay, but Beza didn't relate it back to earlier guys. I mean, he's using it against the theologians of his time, the Molinists, and he's lobbying, he's accusing them of that. But Beza isn't accusing, isn't saying anything. And you have we have a long history of this in the Roman Catholic Church, going back to the Gallic monks. And this is one of the things that we as reformers are trying to weed out of the Christian faith. He doesn't do anything like that.
No, he doesn't make that historical connection. But someone shortly thereafter does. Yeah, I'd have to refresh myself.
Okay, so all right, but and then at some point, whoever was the first one to do that, then at some point these three are continually implicated or associated with the view.
Yes.
Okay, and do we have any like later big name theologians who you'd say clearly do that. They connect the three with semi-Pelagianism.
Oh yeah. I mean, all the big name theologians like Wayne Grudem, Roger Olson, Michael Horton.
Okay, those guys are still alive. So this is now we can get controversial and contentious. That's good. We like that here. Okay, I mean, but maybe before where I mean, do you know like where they're getting it from? I'm just thinking again, who are some of the big names in historical theology that
Louis
we know
Berkhoff,
of that make it Berkhoff? Okay, yeah.
Berkhoff, Shedd, yep.
Okay.
These guys who have these big systematic theologies. And the problem is that these guys who wrote these systematic theologies over the last 250 years, they never read the primary sources. So they're dependent upon secondary or even tertiary sources to come up with their content for that section on semi-Pelagianism.
So if I understand, Kurt, what you're saying, you don't agree with their assertion, that connection? Is that what you're thus asserting?
Correct. And it's, let me be clear, it's not just me. Almost unanimous agreement among historical theologians who have read the primary sources. There's almost, if not unanimous agreement that the Gallic monks were not semi-Pelagian by this common definition out there in systematic theology textbooks. So whether the historical theologian is Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or even Protestants, if you read the primary sources, you're going to come away saying, oh, dang, Cassian didn't think that. He held to a different view. Now, there's debates about that view, but it's definitely not what's defined as semi-Pelagianism.
Well, I think it's interesting. We're talking about, these different times, back to the 400s, the Reformation, talked about Shedd in the 1800s. And it's just, it'd be interesting just to think about how well they would articulate these ideas. They wouldn't even use a term back in the 400, and so they were just maybe, like you said earlier, just trying to come up with a way of putting these things together in a lot of ways for some of these things were the first time that was being done. So I was curious if you saw how cogent some of these arguments where they would attribute or misattribute from each of those time frames.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what happened was it was an attempt to explain one's theological opponents while recognizing that they were neither Augustinian nor Pelagian. And so they just largely Reformed systematic theologians kind of created this middle ground. And the problem with that is that it's not a binary spectrum. It's not this, hey, here's this extreme, here's this extreme, you fall somewhere in between, right? We call that a false dichotomy when you only have the two options, and maybe we'll try to create this middle ground between. There's whole different ball games, like, for example, on nature and grace. This Augustinian Pelagianism spectrum is the either-or spectrum. Either the grace of God comes first or the free will of man, right? It's kind of, but again, if you hold to a both-and spectrum, it's both the grace of God and the free will of man working, say, concurrently, the doctrine of concurrence. That is different than what Augustine held. And so the Gallic monks just don't fall on that spectrum. But the reformers, who were Augustinian themselves, and I'll say later Augustinian, they're, again, trying to place their Roman Catholic opponents, or maybe even their fellow Protestant opponents, on that spectrum. And that's, I think, how the erroneous theological construct of semi-Pelagianism was birthed and evolved.
Because the reformers are going to argue for later Augustine, strong emphasis on grace, but they're not. They wouldn't feel, obviously they can't. You can't accuse the Roman Catholic theologians of being Pelagians straight out either, right? I mean, because that's not going to fly. So you have to invent, or Beza starts slinging around the term semi-Pelagian, because this obviously all relates to the doctrine of justification. This is what we're talking about here in the hinge upon which the Reformation, the theological hinge upon which the Reformation hangs, is justification, right? So the semi-Pelagian position, or the creation of a semi-Pelagian position, is to cast Rome's understanding of justification in a negative light, but not so extreme. You can't just call it straight out Pelagianism either, because obviously it's something other than that, right? And Pelagius was condemned by a church council. So, okay. So let's get into then exactly what the Gallic monks say about nature and grace and
sure, yes,
justification, or what might be is later called justification, but for them is the concursive work of God with the human will.
Yes. Now, so in my work, I don't get into their view of justification. I think that would be interesting to explore for a later research project down the line. But just looking at their views of nature and grace, yeah, I've got 2 or 3 just selections here from Cassian's work. And this comes from Conference 13, which is arguably the most controversial because it does have some passages which are a little, perplexing head turners. But here we go. So this is chapter 3, Conference 13. Let's see here. Cassian writes, from which we clearly infer that the initiative, not only of our actions, but also of good thoughts, comes from God, who inspires us with a good will to begin with and supplies us with the opportunity of carrying out what we rightly desire. I mean, that right there is explicitly contrary to the definition. All right, that's one selection. Here we go. And therefore, though in many things, indeed in everything, it can be shown that men always have need of God's help, and that human weakness cannot accomplish anything that has to do with salvation by itself alone. Take that, Shedd, right? Because William Shedd talked about semi-Pelagianism.
Shedd says, so far as the rational and voluntary nature of man is concerned, the semi-Pelagian asserts that holiness, like sin, must be self-originated by each individual. End quote. Okay, so
no, and for Cassian, even faith is a gift, which is very Augustinian, you'd say. But we really shouldn't evaluate Cassian on Augustinian terms or standards. But nevertheless, he does view faith as a gift. Yeah, so it just continues on. There's a plethora of passages like this where Cassian talks about the robust grace of God in everything, for every good thing. And there's no sense in which man of his own accord, as if we could even speak of man doing things outside of divine grace. I mean, divine grace includes man's existence and sustenance and ability to make free will actions. All of this comes from God's grace. Now, we might, at the end of the day, we might conclude that it's a different type of grace. So Calvinists especially will affirm what's called regenerative grace. Cassian, that's not his view. But nevertheless, he still holds to grace. The question is, what is that model of grace that he holds to? And like I said, I argue he would defend what we would call a concurrent model of grace. So that's different from the Calvinist and the Arminian model, but it's not one that is devoid of grace at all, or that grace comes later. That's not his view. So as you guys heard, I read straight from Conference 13, and plenty of other passages for that. In everything, God's grace is required.
I would even say this, and I'm not going to chart, but I just finished Clement of Alexandria. Like, I read every word of Clement of Alexandria. And I would say Clement of Alexandria probably sounds a little closer to Pelagius than Cassian does there in some select passages. And again, I don't think you can ever just take
Clement's a lot earlier.
Yeah,
Clement's a lot earlier, and you do see, the development
early
of
third.
Right.
So, just for context, Clement is ante-Nicene father. So, this is pre-Augustine. with Clement. But yeah, I'm looking at Shedd again here. Here's what Shedd says he says it's the only distinguishing factor between Pelagianism and Semi-Pelagianism. He says Semi-Pelagianism holds the same opinion as far as holiness or sin originating in the individual, accepting that it concedes a transmission of a vitiated physical nature, end quote, which I'm assuming he's talking about the corruption of the body. I mean, that's not much difference then, really. If the physical nature is the only thing that is vitiated, that the Semi-Pelagian so-called accepts. Okay, so that's Cassian. That was Cassian, right? That we were reading from?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And I'm assuming we would find similar explicit statements on grace in the other two as well.
Yeah, so you don't have as many in Vincent, but in Faustus you have just the same amount. I mean, he wrote a work on the grace of God and free will of man. So De Gratia Dei. Yeah, you get similar passages in Faustus, but again, not as many in Vincent. But in Vincent, you can piece together what his view is on this, and it makes sense because he's part of this local tradition of Gallic theology that he was taught and that he passes on.
You made the point that Grudem uses this kind of language. Michael Horton. Yep. I mean, these are guys who are well respected. And I think you mentioned one other. It's in Shedd. We just read Shedd. But okay,
Roger Olson, who's an Arminian theologian.
Roger Olson, yes, my colleague at Patheos. And all guys that I like to read. I mean, these are all theologians that I respect greatly. I haven't read Olson that much, but I've read Michael Horton stuff, and I read Grudem. It was one of the first systematic theology texts I read. Because there's sort of a redemptive work, I think, here that needs to be done, right? I mean, if this is a historical straw man, again, I said it earlier, then, I mean, what would be some of the ramifications, some of the things that you would want to see in contemporary theology amongst Reformed theologians, as this redemption, you've used this term yourself, the redemption of these monks becomes more and more, people become more aware of it. Like, what should be done then?
Well, so, one of the reasons why I picked this project in particular is that I am not asking Calvinists who are the perpetrators, perpetuators. They are the ones continuing this straw man. I'm not asking them to change their views on election or total depravity or how they interpret Paul. I'm not asking, and those people hold near and dear to their hearts, right? I'm asking them to revise their history books. I'm asking them to reconsider the Gallic monks as semi-Pelagians, and that the conclusion should be they were not semi-Pelagian. So now one option is you say it's just this, we could say semi-Pelagianism is an impersonal construct. Here's the problem I have with that. When we've looked at the development of Christian doctrine, historically speaking, when we've looked at heresies that have arisen, it has always been in response to a teacher or a proliferator of that position. And the church has responded with saying, that is not our belief. That is outside of what we've always believed. Okay? That's how doctrine has developed historically. So what's happened here with semi-Pelagianism is it's been a slur that's evolved into this theological construct of a possible middle ground. We could think of other possible options on that spectrum, and they're all semi-Pelagianism. Because one step one way is one, but what about semi-Augustinianism? No, that's not. So it's this construct, and if we are going to allow people to create possible constructs, we're going to have an almost infinite amount of semi-heresies.
So possible heresies, but that no concrete theologian or has ever actually
Bingo.
has ever actually held or tried to propagate, right, as well.
Correct.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Because you could say, okay, in theory, maybe there was somebody who believed something like this, but did they ever proclaim it and try and sort of teach it and watch and see it grow and fester and so on and so forth?
Yeah. Tell me, where is the theologian? Now, lay persons will believe all sorts of things, including all sorts of false doctrines.
That's what I meant.
I'm talking,
you could have, obviously,
theologians, right? Show me a theologian who will say there is no divine grace in the free will act to accept the gospel. Where is that theologian who's ever defended that in writing? I'll sit and wait, because I don't know of any theologian.
Other than Pelagius himself, or I don't know, or some other people who've everybody roundly condemns. Like
I'm just using the definition.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm just using the definition of the common definition of semi-Pelagianism.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Because Pelagius would go further, right? I mean, it's
right.
Yeah.
So it's a position that was constructed by Orthodox Reformed theologians, put it that way, to talk about a view that nobody was actually historically held or tried to defend or propagate. And okay, so
it's the boogeyman. It's the boogeyman. The boogeyman. Be scared of the boogeyman, but the secret is that the boogeyman doesn't exist. Right.
Right. Okay. Good.
So,
and again, as you pointed out, this is a correction to the history books.
Yeah.
Mainly, it's not to say this has nothing to do with whether or not the Reformed view, the Calvinist view, is right or wrong, whether that's a correct or incorrect theological assessment or judgment, or the Roman Catholic view. It's just to say that this view was made up. Nobody ever held it. It's a straw man, and we really should wipe the term and the idea, start to make the corrections in the contemporary theological textbooks. Start to make those corrections.
That's right.
And in so doing, redeem the names of these faithful
yes,
Gallic monks.
I mean, Augustine called them Orthodox brethren, and that they don't commit the error of Pelagius.
Right.
We should do the same thing.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Well, good. Well, I'm glad we got to do this again. Like this is our it's not our Christ and
nerding
podcast.
Out session.
This is our theological nerding out. Yeah. So for the 10 people who will watch this, I hope that, but I do hope that, it's not like, it's kind of like, a big historical thing though. I mean, it's been, this is like hundreds of years of propagating a straw man. It's
well,
like a small thing.
And for guys like you who have gone to seminary and you've learned systematic theology, you're reading Shedd and Grudem and this, you are being taught
right
a historical inaccuracy. And so it perpetuates to all of the seminary students throughout, evangelicalism.
Right.
And it really needs to be corrected.
That's good. All right, Kurt Jaros, not Jaros or Jaros. It's good talking to you, my friend. This has been a nice time. We'll do it again. Maybe next time we will get Owen Anderson on here and we'll have a little bit back and forth on justification. But
it's nice meeting you too, Kurt. So glad we could have the time to talk about these things.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks for joining.
Okay, sure. God bless, brother. Yeah, see you next time.